I've now finished The Mirror in the Light by Hilary Mantel, and so I come at last to the end of Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell trilogy. This is the third book in the trilogy, which follows Thomas Cromwell's life from the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536. It actually picks up exactly where the previous book left off, with the scene of Anne Boleyn's execution. And it follows 4 years in Thomas Cromwell's life to, spoiler alert, Thomas Cromwell's own execution at the end. The very last page, spoiler alert. Very last page is what it feels like to have your head chopped off from Thomas Cromwell's perspective. Told in what I believe is referred to as third-person limited narration, but we are inside Thomas Cromwell's thoughts throughout this. This is the final book in the trilogy, and I believe the longest. The page numbers seem to vary depending on what edition you have. Wikipedia says that the hardcover was 883 pages. I've got the soft cover here, which was 757 pages, but they are big pages. Compare this with my edition of Bringing Up the Bodies, the second book, and you can see that it's both taller and wider, longer, broader. So more room for more words on the page. And this book did take me a while to get through. I started it in September. I did get distracted by a number of other things while I was reading this. I won't get into that. That's only of interest to me. But for one reason or another, my attention was split for much of that time, which is another reason I made slow progress. But it is a big book, and in my opinion, it moves slowly. I know there are some people out there who really like this book, and you're just gonna have to forgive me for this. The fault is probably mine. I'm just not literary enough to appreciate a well-written piece of beautiful literature like this. But I found it tiresome. So once again, I return to the complaints I've had all along with the Hilary Mantel Thomas Cromwell trilogy, or maybe it's not so much of a complaint as just acknowledging my own limitations. But these books are historical fiction, and I like historical fiction. It's one of my favorite genres. I find it a very pleasant way to learn history. Usually when I read historical fiction, I want to find out what happened. I want the details of the narrative, and I don't want it told to me like a dry history. I want it to come alive with some storytelling techniques, but I don't want to get too bogged down in pages of introspection. And like the other books in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy by Hilary Mantel, this has pages of introspection. Like there will be several pages where the plot is not moving at all, and we're just inside Thomas Cromwell's mind, and he's thinking about the nature of Tudor England or the countryside, or there are a lot of flashbacks in this book. A lot of flashbacks to his time is learning trades in Italy. A lot of flashbacks back to his father and his family in Putney, England, where he grew up. Now, the first book was very heavy on Thomas Cromwell and his relationship with his father and his origins. And I put up with that in the first book because it was the first book. And then we got into the second book, and the plot's moving a bit more towards the center of politics in Tudor England. But now in this third book, we spend a lot of time going back to Thomas Cromwell's origins. And at certain points, I lost patience with it. I thought, oh, come on, we did this already in the first book. I want to get moving and find out where the story is going. People like me who are always impatient to get moving and find out where the story is going are going to have their patience tested. by this book. There is stuff that happens in this book. Of course, it would be an exaggeration to say that nothing happens. A number of things do happen. So, spoiler alert, once again, that's the last time I'll mention this, but I'll try and go through and as best as I can recall, talk about some of the plot that has happened. So it starts off with right where the previous book left off, at Anne Boleyn's execution day. We go into the the King Henry VIII marrying Jane Seymour, and the Seymour family coming into prominence at court. They are allies of Thomas Cromwell. Henry's other daughter, Mary, has not reconciled to him, and has refused to recognize. She is still loyal to Rome, and her dead mother, and is reluctant to recognize her father's authority over her and the church. So much so that, at least in the context of this book, I'm not sure how historically accurate it is. It might well be historically accurate. It looks like Henry is going to lose his patience with her, and may agree to have her executed. Thomas Cromwell goes through a lot of work to get Mary to swallow her pride and accept and pledge obedience to her father, and accept her father's authority over her, and thereby saves her life from the impending doom. Henry has another son. It's an illegitimate son, who is known as Richmond, the Duke of Richmond, and I think his name was Hilary, if I remember right. Who has been a prominent character in all three of these books, but after initially angling towards a place in the succession, he gets sick and dies. So Henry's one son is dead. But he gets another son by his new wife, Jane Seymour. But then Jane Seymour dies shortly after giving birth from complications of the birth. There is an uprising, Catholic uprising in northern England, which is yeah. You know, when you read history, there are always these peasant uprisings happening every few years, or that seems to be the way of it when you read history. What I didn't really realize, or maybe I had known this and forgotten at one point, was just how powerful this peasant uprising was, and how Henry VIII's armies were not able to put it down. And so that takes up a lot of the middle of the book, although it's always told. We're never there at the front lines, because the main character, Thomas Cromwell, whose perspective we are limited to, is never there at the front lines. He's at the center of court, so he hears it being reported. It's always something that's happening off in the distance. It's there, but it's not one of the more important plot lines of the book. There's a scandal involving Henry's niece, which her name was, I think, Mary or Margaret Douglas, who gets engaged to the Duke of Norfolk's brother without the king's permission. Thomas Cromwell uncovers it, or actually his protege, how do you pronounce it name? Risley uncovers it. And Thomas Cromwell leads the investigation, and they are locked in the tower. The Duke of Norfolk's younger brother eventually dies in the tower of disease, but Margaret or Mary Douglas is released. There is the king's cousin, I believe, Reginald Pole, is going around stirring up trouble in Europe, and siding with the Pope against Henry, which causes Henry to go into all sorts of fury, and Henry wants Cromwell to get Reginald Pole. Reginald Pole always stays outside of the grasp of Thomas Cromwell. He's in Europe. It's unclear exactly how Thomas Cromwell does have a big spy network all throughout Europe. Has been portrayed in this book. Again, I'm not quite sure how historically accurate that is. But for one reason or another, he just can't get his hands on Reginald Pole. But some of Reginald Pole's family and allies are eventually convicted of conspiracy and hauled into the tower, and some of them are killed. What else happens? I'm just trying to remember all the different incidents that happen in this book. And then, of course, near the end is the big one. That's Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, who Thomas Cromwell helps arrange that marriage. But then Henry is displeased with Anne of Cleves when she arrives and wants Thomas Cromwell to get him out of that marriage. Thomas Cromwell is reluctant to get Henry out of that marriage because he can see all the trouble that it's going to cause. Already they have kind of scoured Europe for a suitable bride for Henry. At least as it's portrayed in this book, it feels like they've exhausted all of their options. Henry's credit with the other European princes as being a suitable man to give your daughter to would be immediately gone once he discarded Anne of Cleves for no reason. Anne of Cleves, by the way, was a princess of one of the smaller German states. And as well, Thomas Cromwell really wanted the alliance with these Protestant German states against the alliance of the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, which is formed up in the second part of this book. So for all those reasons, Cromwell is reluctant to free the king from his marriage, and he should have known better, because the failure to get Henry out of his marriage is what had doomed his predecessor, and in this book, in this series, his mentor, Cardinal Wolsey, way back in book 1. So it's kind of surprising that Cromwell doesn't see the danger there. Steve Donahue, in his written review of this book, which he published in the Christian Science Monitor, says it's a little bit of a mystery in the novel itself, and it's a mystery in the historical record. Why Cromwell didn't see the immediate danger he was in and just move heaven and earth to get the king out of his marriage, like he had done twice before. The first with Catherine of Aragon, the second with Anne Boleyn, where Thomas Cromwell just did whatever it took to get King Henry out of those marriages. In this case, he's dragging his feet and his enemies pounce on him. They manufacture a bunch of charges against him. He is betrayed by two of his proteges, one of which Thomas Cromwell had been acting as a father figure to. So that was particularly hurtful to him. And that action where he gets arrested and his enemies are grilling him with questions in the jail, and he's trying to match wits with them and bounce their questions back to them, even though he knows he's doomed. Those sections are very good because stuff is actually happening and the plot is moving. Another thing I should mention. I think most people who pick this book up know that Thomas Cromwell is going to die at the end of it. Even if you didn't know anything about Thomas Cromwell before you started this trilogy, I can't imagine all but very few people wouldn't have been checking Wikipedia or wouldn't be seeing what's going on So I think almost everybody who picks this book up knows that this is the book where Thomas Cromwell dies at the end. I have actually one coworker um, who told me he loved the first book, loved the second book, bought the third book, but he said he just doesn't have the heart to read it because he doesn't want to see Thomas Cromwell die at the end of it. Thomas Cromwell is a very sympathetic character in these books. Perhaps he was not quite as nice in real history as he is portrayed in these books, but in these books he's portrayed as a very sympathetic and likable character. So you are very much rooting for him, and you don't want to see his downfall, and yet you know that his downfall is coming. And yet his downfall doesn't really come until the last 50 pages. And it comes very suddenly. There are small little hints ahead of time that Cromwell is ignoring some warning signals, but they're very small hints. And the whole thing with Henry just kind of changing his mind on Anne of Cleves happens very quickly. And then even more quickly when Henry decides to blame Thomas Cromwell for it. So it's really the last 50 pages, I don't know, maybe the last 60 pages or 70 pages, where you get into the tragedy of Thomas Cromwell, where it's his fall and then lead up to his death. And like I said, initially it's quite exciting. Things are happening very quickly. He's arraigned by his enemies. There's some back and forth and question and answer scenes. But then it just really slows down again. And the last 50 pages or so are just more introspection and just him thinking about his life and meeting with people and talking and just once again it tried my patience. I was getting a little sick of it, of all this kind of let me see if I can find a passage here. It may be worth reading just to give a flavor here of what it's like here. Sorry, I'm not sure I can find the perfect passage. There are just, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. Here's a good example. It has stopped raining. Looking out from his windows in the Queen's lodging, he can see the summer dying back. He remembers the whole world a swill in those years before the cardinal came down. He remembers fetching Raft to the house at Fenchurch Street, and how he dripped on the floor and Lizzie unwrapped him from his layers. He thinks, she died before I had anything. I had Austin Friars, but it was a lawyer's house. When I was a cardinal's man, she never saw me for weeks on end. I might as well have been a sailor on the sea. She stood at the head of the stairs, wearing her white cap. She said, "Let me know when you're coming home." I wrote my will after she was dead, and what had I to leave my son in those days was £600 and 12 silver spoons. On the day the bill of attainder passes, Stephen Gardiner comes back. He wraps his coat around himself as if he is chilly. I have come to ask you about the king's so-called marriage. The turn of phrase is enough to make him understand what is required. I will write everything down for you from the beginning. Omit nothing, Gardiner says, from your first negotiations with Cleves to the night of the supposed marriage. You must set forth all you have heard of the lady's pre-contract with Lorraine. Okay, it's getting a little bit back into the story there, but that paragraph where he's kind of thinking back on his life and how far he's come is very typical of the last 50 pages. And I put up with it more in the last 50 pages if it wasn't very typical of the whole book. The whole book is kind of him looking back on his life and thinking how far he has come. It's a big theme all throughout the book. And then when he's awaiting his execution, it just gets much more intense, and I don't know. I'm glad I read this trilogy. I feel like I did learn some history from it. Of course, half of what I've learned I'm going to forget in 5 years or a year or something like that. It's always, when you reach my age, it's always a little bit disconcerting to realize how much you've forgotten. So I've mentioned this a few times before when talking about this trilogy, but I have watched the Tudors, the Showtime drama about Henry VIII, and quite often when I've been reading this trilogy, I'm like, I don't remember this at all. They must have left that out of the Tudors. And then I go to Wikipedia and I find that actually there was like three episodes in the Tudors about that story arc. I just completely forgot about it. So, in another 5 years, probably a lot of this will be completely forgotten. But that digression aside, there is a lot of historical information in here for the history buff who reads historical fiction to get the information out of it, and enjoys the story. But this book is not purely for the history buffs. It's also for people who like a well-written novel, and a particularly poetic novel with a lot of beautiful passages in it about looking back on the English countryside and thinking about your youth and thinking about how far you've come. And those passages are more the majority of this novel than the historical details. So consider yourself forewarned ahead of time, dear reader, and make your selection accordingly. As for myself, I'm glad I read it, but I'm also glad I'm done with it.